So what I'm going to talk about is what is urban design, as I see it from a planner's perspective, and why is it important? Why are we actually trying to do this urban design thing that more and more people are talking about? And as Patrick said, what are some of the barriers that are stopping us doing urban design in New Zealand? And throughout it, I'm going to actually, rather than a section at the end, I'm actually going to be interjecting and giving some suggestions as to how we can do it better. And as I say, urban design is a phrase that's started to crop up more and more, particularly over the last 10 years. We happen to come across having to do more and more urban design analysis and assessments to submit with projects, and we're coming across more and more urban design panels. So I think it's important that we do keep asking ourselves what it is that these assessments are going to have to contain and what it is that the panels are going to be looking for. So that's partly the point of my presentation. As you can probably tell, and as Patrick said, I made a transition myself from the UK to New Zealand a few years ago. I also made the transition, as I say, from town planning to urban design, and I represent town planning there as a pile of books, because I went to university thinking that town planning was, perhaps I was misled a little bit, but thought it was planning towns, only to find that once I started my career, university was pretty good. We learnt about things like Ebenezer Howard's plans for garden cities, and we looked at some of the great sort of planned cities of the world, things like, anybody know where this is? Paris, yeah, great. Bit of audience participation required. Anybody know this one then? No, this is Edinburgh, New Town, just next to the castle, and this one's fairly obvious, Barcelona, yeah. And, sorry, go back a second. Yeah, I've quickly discovered that once I started my planning career that we didn't actually get to plan towns, really. Town planning was actually more about writing rules and policies, and you actually needed to be an expert in grammar rather than an expert in design, and that somebody else was designing these places, or actually maybe they weren't. I think if you look at places that have just shown these amazing planned cities, particularly in the 19th century, people like Ebenezer Howard or Haussmann, who was largely responsible, credited for Paris's redesign. You think, what were they? Were they planners? Were they architects? Were they anything? I think Haussmann was a military strategist, but they just sort of knew how to make good places. They were probably sort of civic planners. And I think what's happened over the last 50 years particularly is that planning's actually dropped the ball a little bit. It perhaps was planners who were ultimately responsible for the design of our cities, and planners got sort of consumed by this sort of legal process, got so many challenges, they had to start defending themselves, started writing more and more complex rules in order to defend themselves, and that in itself just was a catch-22 situation. And the actual role and responsibility of designing our cities, thinking about how they all come together, has sort of been left in a bit of a vacuum, and with no one profession actually sort of taking responsibility there. And I think that's where sort of urban design has sort of emerged to take that responsibility. Why do we do it? Well, I think because we're faced with a series of challenges across the world, internationally and nationally. Climate change, obviously one of the most talked about. We know the impacts of that, particularly in things like sea level and unpredictable weather. We've got threats to our biodiversity, pollution, loss of species and air quality. We're looking at the end of the fossil fuel era at some point in the next 2 to 50 years. Certainly we're going to have to find ways around that. And that leads on to issues about energy production. And I think that's where New Zealand is extremely well placed. If you think of energy richness in terms of renewable sources, we're about as good as you can get, I think. Food production equally, as more and more food production is diverted into fuels. Again, New Zealand is extremely well placed in terms of producing food with the climate it's got. Faced with an increasing population, these are, as I say, global issues as well as national issues, but particularly an aging population. More and more people getting into that older bracket where mobility is a bit more of an issue. Health, I think, is an issue, and particularly obesity. I'm going to come on to this a little bit later. It's a little bit of a pet subject of mine. And social exclusion, and there is still an increasing separation, distribution of wealth. I think all of these things come together, and these affect our quality of life. And I heard a speaker recently say perhaps a little bit alarmist, but I think there may be some truth in it, that perhaps we're the first generation to think that the following generation from us might not have as good a quality life as we've had. I think every generation before us has probably seen improvements and can look back on that and think, yes, definitely improved. But I think that's quite a sobering thought. And I think with all these things, and this is a quote from the UK, that how we do our built environment affects so many of those things, that too often we just think it's about sort of buildings and that's it. But it's about how we actually inhabit our places, our everyday environments, from small-scale villages to and remote houses all the way up to big cities. How we actually conduct and carry out our built environment affects so much. So this urban planning applies on a whole series of scales. I think at a city scale, we have to think about how all the different components and elements that make up a city come together, where our town centres are, shopping areas, retail, parks, and how we move between all of those places. It also applies at a neighbourhood scale, again thinking about where the schools are in relation to our housing and how people move through and smaller open spaces. And then the area probably that we get to exercise most design on is at the sort of site level, or maybe large sites to small sites, and this is where we get to design most, and often this is where the sort of urban design is concentrated, the issue of urban design is concentrated. But if you look at any particular place, that could be anywhere, you think that what does it consist of? You know, what does that place consist of? It's an incredible array of components and different elements. You've got buildings of all sorts of different uses, places to live, places to work, institutional uses, educational uses. Then you throw in there the trees, the planting, streets, open space, signs, other infrastructure, utilities that you can't see. Actually a huge collection of things there all going on, all probably designed by particular designers, all with their own little responsibility. But it's fair to say that in the main, our places consist of two main components really, and that's buildings and spaces. And that obviously gives rise to the phrase, the figure ground, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And one of the earliest figure ground diagrams is Nolli's plan of Rome. And interestingly, on this he showed spaces within buildings that were publicly accessible in white as well. So it gives the impression of more space than perhaps there actually is. And if you look at a modern figure ground, this could be anywhere, but it's part of Auckland. Not attempting to suggest that we compare this with Nolli's plan of Rome. But the great thing about a figure ground sketch is that it doesn't matter what scale it's at, it immediately just shows the relationship of building to space, how much building there is compared to how much space there is. And I think it's fair to say, or I've got to say it in a room of architects, that actual design and quality of our buildings has improved, and we're doing some great buildings. And I think it's also fair to say that we're doing some great spaces. But what's critical is how the buildings and the spaces actually come together. But most importantly is the people. Without the people, it's actually pointless doing any of that. We need to understand how the people want to move through those spaces into the buildings and vice versa. Understanding that human behaviour and maybe even manipulating human behaviour so that we can inhabit our spaces to meet some of those challenges that I was talking about before. And a classic example of where I don't think this is working, apologies to anybody involved in the Assa Square project here in Auckland, but here we have a space that isn't particularly working well, was needed to have a look at this space, partly because of the structural problems with the car park, but we knew it was a space not a great space anyway, and we've come up with a design for that space that largely focuses on the space itself. And I think one of the disappointing elements of this is that we forget that the quality of any particular space, any quality town square, city square, depends probably almost primarily on the quality of the buildings around the outside and how those buildings interact with the space, rather than the actual quality of the space itself, the surface of the space. And perhaps a little bit unfairly comparing it to one of the best squares in the world, Piazza San Marco in Venice.